对委内瑞拉人民而言，过去这个周末并不太平。23日，委内瑞拉与巴西边境发生警民冲突，造成至少2人死亡，10多人受伤。仍忠于现任总统马杜罗的军队采取强硬手段，包括催泪瓦斯和橡皮子弹，阻止人道主义物资进入委内瑞拉。此后，美国国务卿蓬佩奥表示，会考虑对委内瑞拉追加制裁，迫使马杜罗向反对派领袖瓜伊多交出政权，还称马杜罗剩下的当权日子指日可数。美国副总统彭斯25日也正与瓜伊多会晤，讨论应对马杜罗的最新政策。一场军事介入的可能性似乎越来越大。美国自宣布支持反对派领袖瓜伊多开始，就一直给马杜罗施加压力。先有原油制裁，后有川普在迈阿密给委内瑞拉人民加油打气。然而，国际社会上不乏谴责美国干预别国政治的声音。西班牙比方说，就在25日声明不会支持任何对委内瑞拉的军事干预。2002年建立的放手委内瑞拉 Hands of Venezuela 组织，目的一直都是反对任何外国政权干预委内瑞拉本国政治。今天的明镜连线中，该组织的秘书豪尔赫马丁 Jorge Martin 就周末发生的委内瑞拉边境上的冲突与我们进行了对话。在我们的讨论中，马丁把这场冲突定义为一场由政治而不是人道主义物资引起的冲突。他认为，美国以运送人道主义物资为借口，实际上以政权交替为目的，赤裸裸并不是在关心委内瑞拉人民。美国总统川普之前还任命艾略特·艾布兰负责监督恢复委内瑞拉民主的所有行动。但是，此人在1980年代支持中美洲的暴力反革命，还曾经因为对国会撒谎而被定罪过。马丁认为，在这种干预之下，委内瑞拉政府决定关闭边界的决定是可以理解的。马丁还对人们认为马杜罗独裁、腐败等指控做出了分析。他认为，马杜罗是在去年通过正规选举以多数的选票得以连任的。而川普对马杜罗的指控，这样看来虚情假意。马丁说，因为川普本人都没有获得选举的多数票，支持的还是一个没有经过任何法律程序而自称总统的反对派领袖。最后，马丁说，委内瑞拉的未来应该由委内瑞拉人民自己决定。从历史来看，每一次美国通过军事介入别国政治，得到的都是更糟糕的后果。看看伊朗和利比亚就知道了。如果美国决定通过出兵应对马杜罗，这会给委内瑞拉带来一场前所未有的灾难。以下，请听马丁和我关于委内瑞拉冲突和美国干预行动的对话。
Could you explain to us, especially for our audience that are not too familiar with this organization, what does Hands of Venezuela mean, and what kind of goal is your campaign trying to accomplish?
Yes, the Hands of Venezuela campaign was established in 2002. At the time after the coup in April 2002, there was a coup sponsored by the United States against the democratically elected president Hugo Chavez. And the coup was defeated by the masses on the streets. They defeated the coup. They brought back the president. And so we decided to organize a solidarity campaign with the Bolivarian revolution. And the main aims of this campaign is, one, to oppose imperialist intervention in the affairs of Venezuela, mainly on the part of the United States, but also other foreign powers, including the European Union and so on. Number two, to cut through the fog of lies and half-truths in the mass media about what is really going on in Venezuela. And three, to establish solidarity and direct links between the working people of Venezuela and the working people in the rest of the world to share experiences and so on.
And over the weekend, there is an intense showdown over the Venezuelan border on humanitarian aid. Who do you think is responsible for the injuries?
I think the showdown is not about humanitarian aid. This has nothing to do with humanitarian aid. The United States has never cared about the plight of the people anywhere in the world. But they have always attempted to dress imperialist intervention with the disguise of humanitarian aid or any other lies that they have concocted in order to justify military intervention. For instance, in the case of Iraq, it was weapons of mass destruction. In the case of Libya, it was the immediate danger for the people of Benghazi. And they always make up one excuse or another. And in this case, the excuse is humanitarian aid. But the aim is regime change. What they are after is the removal of the democratically elected government of Venezuela. For instance, the United States has just, in the last few weeks, seized Venezuelan assets worth $8 billion US, and the total amount of this aid that they are supposed to be giving to Venezuela is 20 million. The Red Cross, the international organization of the Red Cross, has said that they are not in favor of this so-called humanitarian aid, because any aid effort needs to be done in conjunction with the government of the country receiving the aid, which is not the case here. And so what we have is military aircraft from the United States delivering aid to the Colombian border and to the Brazilian border with Venezuela. Delivered by people like Elliot Abrams, an official in the U.S. administration who's responsible for human rights abuses in Central America in the 1980s, who was convicted for lying to Congress about the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. And of course, in this context, it is justified for the Venezuelan government to close off the borders, because they can see that this is not about humanitarian aid. This is about an aggressive stance at the border, an attempt to enter the country illegally by foreign powers. So this is, I think, what's responsible for the clashes at the weekend and for the regrettable loss of life that accompanied it.
However, would you admit that the living standard or the people's lives in Venezuela is deteriorating?
Yes, there is a very serious economic crisis in Venezuela, which has now entered into its fifth year. But of course, this crisis, this economic crisis, which is affecting the living standards of millions of Venezuelans, is also aggravated by U.S. sanctions. U.S. sanctions do not help the Venezuelan people. Or, for instance, the fact that the British government is withholding $1.2 billion US dollars in gold reserves that the Venezuelan government had deposited in the Bank of England. This is certainly not helping the Venezuelan people. The fact that U.S. sanctions prevent Venezuela from selling oil to the United States also is not helping, is making the situation much worse. And if we look at the past record of the United States, we can see any country where the United States has intervened, it has made the situation worse from the point of view of the population. Take, for instance, Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya more recently. We were told that this was a humanitarian intervention, and nevertheless the situation of the masses now is much worse in Libya than it was before this military intervention.
Then if people in Venezuela are in need of humanitarian aid and you don't think the U.S. should be giving them that, then who would be able to provide Venezuelan people with what they are desperately in need of now?
Well, first of all, I will not agree with the idea that there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Okay. In Venezuela, there is an economic crisis, which is very serious and is affected badly the living standards of people. Purchasing power of wages has gone down. There is hyperinflation. Many people have had to migrate from the country. But this is not a situation like the United States wants to paint it, where hundreds of thousands of people are in danger of dying immediately if there's no humanitarian aid sent in, as might be the case in other countries. I don't know, in the Yemen, where Saudi Arabia, which is a regime that is friendly to the United States, is organized a war and imposed a blockade that is killing millions of people in the Yemen. And of course, the United States is saying nothing about it. But in Venezuela, there is a serious economic crisis, yes, and Venezuela is already receiving aid. For instance, in the last week, it received aid from Russia. It is now negotiating aid from the European Union, and the Venezuelan government is quite happy to negotiate with different governments the purchase of food and medication. What the Venezuelan government is, of course, not happy to do is for a foreign government like the United States, which has recognized an alternative government in the country, the self-appointed Juan Guaido president, and called on the military in Venezuela to rebel against the democratically elected government, to then turn up at the border and say, hello, we want to come in. No, this is not how things work, and this is called imperialist aggression. It has nothing to do with humanitarian aid. If the United States are worried about the situation of the people in Venezuela, they could start by releasing the assets that they have seized and lifting the sanctions that they have imposed. That will certainly go a long way to help the people of Venezuela.
You just mentioned democratically elected President Maduro, but there are a lot of accusations against what you've just said, and especially U.S. President Trump saying that it's elected illegally, his dictatorship is harming the Venezuelan people, and the failing economy is also caused by him. What do you think of these accusations?
Yes, there were elections in Venezuela on the 20th of May last year, 2018, and President Maduro won that election by a big majority. It is not true that the Venezuelan opposition was prevented from standing. In fact, there were 3 opposition candidates. One of them, Henry Falcón, was one of the main leaders of the opposition. But it is true that another section of the opposition decided to boycott the elections. They were not prevented from standing. They decided to boycott the elections. And they decided to do that under pressure from the United States, which did not want to recognize those elections. Now, you say that there are allegations of fraud in those elections.
Right.
There are some people who are alleging that the elections were fraudulent. But in fact, there was an international commission of observers, including the former Spanish President Zapatero, former President of Spain, who is not necessarily a friend of Maduro or his policies, but he was helping talks between the government and the opposition. And he was one of the observers in the elections, and he said the elections were fair and free, and the results should be recognized. I mean, it is a bit hypocritical for President Trump of the United States, about whom there are many allegations of irregularities during the election, who didn't even win the popular vote, to now turn around and say, okay, the elections in this other country are not valid. I mean, I think that is for the people of Venezuela to decide who's the president of Venezuela, and not for President Trump in the United States or President Bolsonaro in Brazil to decide who's the president of Venezuela.
However, it seems like that the U.S. is not even backing down. Mike Pence is meeting with Guaido today, and Trump even delivered an address last week in Miami to Venezuelan Americans. So are you concerned, and do you think this is raising the chance of Guaido eventually coming to power?
I am very concerned, because what this means is that the United States administration has decided that they don't like the government in Venezuela, and they are going to use all means at their disposal to remove this government in another country. Now, just imagine if, say, the government of China was to say, well, we don't like the government of Donald Trump, and we're calling on the U.S. Army to remove the government of Donald Trump, and we don't recognize Donald Trump, but we recognize someone else, Nancy Pelosi or Bernie Sanders. This will be a complete scandal. But in the case of the United States, they think that they can do whatever they want anywhere in the world. And as you say, there have now been very serious threats. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, has said that the days of Maduro are numbered, and he is now in Bogota meeting with a group of Lima countries to decide what are the next steps. And I am worried that the next step might be military intervention, which will be a complete disaster. It will not help the people of Venezuela, and certainly it will not help democracy, because how is democratic? How democratic is it that a foreign country comes into your own country armed in a military intervention to decide who should be the president? This person, Juan Guaido, has not been elected by anybody. He proclaimed himself to be the president at a street rally on the 23rd of January, and he was immediately recognized by Maduro. But in Venezuela, he has no legitimacy. If he wants to be elected the president, he should stand in the next presidential elections. Or perhaps he should have stood in the elections last year, which he decided to boycott. In fact, this has got nothing to do with Venezuela. This person, Guaido, was complete unknown in December. But then he went to Washington, had meetings with the U.S. administration, had meetings with the Brazilian government, and they told him, if you declare yourself the president, we will recognize you. This is certainly not a democratic way to proceed, but unfortunately, it is the way that the U.S. imperialism proceeds when there are countries whose governments they don't like.
You mentioned a few times that the Venezuelan people should get what they want. Then what do you think Venezuela wants, and who do you think can give them what they want?
I think the Venezuelan people are very divided and polarized ever since the Bolivarian Revolution started. There are people who are in favor, there are people who are against. But in Venezuela, over the last 20 or more years, there have been, I think, 23 or 24 democratic elections and referendums, national, regional, governor elections, council elections. And out of these 23 elections, the opposition has won 2, the National Assembly elections in 2015 and the constitutional referendum earlier on. And the Bolivarian Revolution has won all of the others. So I think that if the opposition wants to change the situation, they need to win a majority. That's as simple as that. They won the election in 2015, and that election was recognized. But if they resort, as they have done for over 20 years, with the support of the United States, to violent uprisings, to rioting, to calling for military coups, to carrying out one military coup already in 2002, then this is not the democratic way to proceed. I'd like to add that whatever position one has about the government of President Maduro, and I am certainly a critic of some of his economic policies. I think that he talks about socialism, but in reality he is not implementing socialist policies. And certainly in Venezuela there are many problems. But I think that foreign military intervention and aggression on behalf of U.S. imperialism is certainly not the solution. Every time that this has been implemented, it has completely failed. And not only this is completely illegal. For instance, the Group of Lima countries that is meeting today in Bogota has no legal standing. The only reason they created the Group of Lima countries a few years ago is because they could not get the necessary amount of votes at the Organization of American States, which is the organization that gathers all of Latin America's, all of the countries in the American continent. And because they cannot get a vote at the Organization of American States, then they create another body which is composed only of countries that oppose the current Venezuelan government and that are organizing and militating and agitating for military intervention. I think this is completely scandalous. And in the same way that Guaido has no constitutional basis for his claims in Venezuela, certainly the Group of Lima countries has no legal standing. It's an ad hoc group of countries whose only aim is to remove the government of Venezuela, which is completely scandalous.
Great. Thank you so much, Jorge.
Okay, thanks a lot.